Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video, and in this video we're back with another Survivor video here, talking about the best players of all time once again, but this time in a pretty unique way, where here I'll be running through the best player for every letter of the alphabet. So here we'll be running through every letter, A through Z, and talking about who the best player is that has their name starting with that letter. So again, this will be an assessment on these players in the grand scheme of things, how I feel about them, and how they would play on any given Survivor season, over just how they specifically played on their actual individual seasons. Now with that, I should mention the fact that I am recording this before the airing of Survivor 47, so while again, potentially some people from 47 could make this list, they won't be on this list, as obviously the season hasn't come out at the time of the recording. So with that, let's actually jump right into it. Again, we're going to start it all off with the letter A. And there are a good chunk of pretty solid players that have their names start with the letter A. I mean, there are already 3 winners eligible here. Again, we got Adam Klein, we got Amber Burkich, we got Ars Perskauskas. However, none of these 3 are particularly great players for me in the grand scheme of things. Obviously, while, again, yeah, they are winners, I do feel like all of these are, again, not exactly the most top tier winners on the board. For a while, again, in a world, they definitely could have been the pick here. I did not end up going with them. I also consider, again, a couple of these pretty big names that are returning players. You got Andrea, you got Aubrey, who, again, definitely were in contention. Aubrey more so. However, I feel like her later appearances were not as strong to me. Also, there's a one-time player here that I very much consider, that being Austin from 45. And again, Austin, I think, played a very solid game and is definitely one of the better one-time players at this point in Survivor history. I did not pick him either. So the person I did go with here for the letter A is actually a player that has played 3 times, that person being Amanda Kimmel. And again, Amanda is a person that is definitely up there in one of the best non-winning players in history of the show, having 2 finalist appearances, both times coming somewhat close to winning. I mean, I do think she had a better final trial performance in China. Again, she could have won. Obviously, in Micronesia, she was literally 1 vote away from a tie. So again, like, that's obviously a very impressive record there. But then she also comes back for Here's the Villains, where she has another pretty solid performance despite having a big target on her back. And in general, again, I think Amanda is a pretty great player of Survivor. I mean, she is someone that is largely affable, someone that is pretty physical to where she's very rarely going to be an early boot, and she's shown a lot of consistency in the game. So again, for me, this was a pretty solid answer here. Next up for the letter B, and this one was a bit tough because while there are a lot of contenders here, there's not really many truly elite players that start with the letter B. I mean, for one-time players, I mean, you got someone like a Becky Lee in Cook Islands, who obviously made it to the end, in a spot where she ran the game alongside Yul, though obviously I think she was a bit too passive in the game for her to be my pick here. Also, I did consider Brett from Samoa, who, again, literally comes 1 challenge away from winning a near unanimous jury vote, to where, again, he's at least in consideration here, but did not make it on. As for returning players, I did consider Brenda Lowe, who, again, has shown a level of consistency. Again, neither of her games are particularly impressive in the grand scheme of things. I also considered Brad Culpepper, obviously a runner-up in Game Changers, and again, at least ran the tribe initially on Blood vs. Water, but again, just not quite enough to be the pick. So really, at this point, we're narrowing it down to the winners that start with the letter B, to where there are 3 of them, 2 of them being some of the lesser winners. So again, for me, there ended up being a pretty solid answer, even though it's even a person I don't particularly like. But either way, again, obviously I'm not going to pick Bob. I mean, again, I've talked so many times about how much I think Bob is a pretty terrible player, especially for a winner. And then we got Ben Draybergen, who I'm also not picking here, where while I think Ben is probably slept on as a player in the grand scheme of things, where I think he's probably a better player than what his winning game demonstrated, but again, it's still not enough to really make him the pick. So the person I'm going with here, I guess, is Brian Heidik. I guess that's who I have to go with. Or again, I try to avoid picking Brian Heidik whenever I can, but I mean, in this situation, I feel like he's pretty clearly the answer. I mean, while I think he's a player that would not acclimate well to the modern day, I feel like he is a player that played a very impressive game for the time, demonstrated a lot of ability for the game that was simply just not shown at that time in the game. And while, again, I don't agree with his tactics, and in reality, I think someone like Ben is probably someone that would do better in a modern game of Survivor. I think when we're looking at this more so from it being based around what we've seen more so than what we can assume, I feel like at the end of the day, again, Brian has demonstrated very few like open flaws in his actual winning season outside the fact that he could barely win a jury vote. To where, again, I guess it's enough to make him the pick for the letter B. Next up for the letter C, and the letter C is actually probably one of the most populated letters for Survivor names, where I have so many contenders for the letter C. I mean, there are so many one-time players that are pretty competent from this letter. I mean, you got two Carolyns. You got both Carolyn Rivera, Carolyn Weiger, both, again, competent players there. Carson also, again, while, again, not biggest Carson fan outside the show, I feel like, again, he played a very impressive game in 44. And Cassidy's a runner-up. She's in contention. Chase Rice was one vote away from winning the game and played a solid game outside that. Again, he was in contention. And you got the likes of Chelsea Meisner, Chrissy Hoffbeck, both finalists there. Charlie from 46 plays a very impressive game as well, was definitely in consideration. Cody from 43, I think, is also, again, a very competent player as well, where essentially if he survives that final 6 round with an idol, he essentially wins the game. And also, I considered Sydney, to where, while, again, Sydney didn't have the greatest jury prospects, I feel like the way she navigated through the game was very impressive. Again, all of them I did not end up picking here. Also, there's some pretty high profile returning players in the letter C. Again, you got Sierra Easton, who, again, was never really that close to contention, but again, someone to mention. Coach obviously comes extremely close to winning South Pacifics, so again, he was in contention. Colby Donaldson obviously claimed very close to winning Australia, and while his next two appearances aren't as good, again, still definitely in contention. Though this is also a letter that has, again, 3 winners within the letter C. I mean, you got the 2 Chris's that have won the show. Again, Chris Underwood, which, again, was never really that close to making the list, but also Chris Doherty, who, again, is a very impressive player and definitely was, again, a bit higher in contention. Also, Cochran is here. Now, obviously, through me having Cochran here, and obviously I had a coach earlier, but, again, you could assume I'm going to be utilizing the nicknames of these players in the cases that they are actually called by these on the show. Like, if it gets to the point where that is their name in the Chiron, I feel like that is the letter I'm going to go by, but even then, Cochran was not the pick here. The person that is the pick here, again, it's kind of obvious if you really think it through. I mean, it's Cirie Fields. I feel like it wasn't that close. I mean, to me, Cirie is the best non-winning player of all time and is one of the best players of all time. I mean, she is the only non-winning player that I have in my top 10 of Survivor players of all time, to where, again, in comparison to the rest of this field, it wasn't that close. It felt like Cirie was number 1 by quite a bit. Next up for the letter D, and what do you know? I might have just said the answer, but again, a decent amount of contenders here as well. I mean, again, a good chunk of one-time players that are pretty solid, from the likes of Danny and Deshawn, both from 41, who, again, both played pretty competent games. Davey Rickenbacker was also in contention, though not really close to being the pick. Devin Pinto, again, is someone that I think played a very impressive game on HHH, so he was in contention. Obviously, got to talk about Dominic, who obviously is the closest person anyone has gone to winning the game. So he was decently close to being the pick here. Drew Basile is also someone that I think is a competent player. So again, I considered him as well. As for returning players, we got the likes of Danielle De Lorenzo, who, again, obviously has a finalist appearance and another deep run, but again, did not pick her. Also considered David Wright, who obviously was one challenge away from winning the entire game in a unanimous vote, while also having another okay game, but again, I did not pick him. Also, I considered Dawn Meehan, who obviously has a finalist appearance and a pretty decent showing on that season, but again, did not pick her. We also have 2 winners from the letter D, where we do have Danny Boatwright and Denise Stapley, both of which I did not pick, considering, again, neither of them are particularly high on my winner player ranking. To be fair, I mean, Danny potentially would have been the pick pre-Winners at War, but obviously Winners at War sank her, while Denise is a player that, again, I think is a bit overrated. But the pick here for the letter D is D from 45, and really it's not that close. I mean, I feel like the biggest contender here was Dominic, but really, I feel like D was a pretty solid answer. I feel like, again, she plays a very well-rounded game. I think she definitely has flaws as a player, but I think in comparison to the field, I think she's definitely amongst the upper echelon of Survivor players, where it did feel like a pretty easy pick here. Next up for the letter E, and this one's pretty easy, and to be fair, there's not really that many contenders anyway, but I do want to at least mention people like, again, Emily from 45, Aaron Lobdale from Tocantins, I think both pretty competent one-time players. You got 2 winners from the letter E that I didn't end up picking, though. Erica is someone that I think I look probably highly than most people, though, again, she was not the ultimate pick, and Ethan Zahn also in consideration, but again, there was a very clear number 1 for this one as well, and that person is Earl Cole. Again, I don't think it's particularly close. I think this is a pretty simple one. I feel like Earl, again, is amongst the best players of all time. Definitely one of the best one-time players of all time, to where, again, amongst the people that we're considering for the letter E, again, I think he's just far and away the number 1 pick here. Next up for the letter F. And, I mean, F is not a particularly great grouping of players. I mean, the only considerations I had here were again, the likes of Franny from 44, who is fine, and like Frosty Zernow, who's also just kind of fine. The person I picked here, though, is a winner, the only winner in contention here, and that person's Fabio. And again, the funny thing is that, again, Fabio wasn't even his real name. If it wasn't for that, I guess the pick would have been Franny, I guess. But even then, I mean, Fabio's not even that great of a player either. I mean, again, he's good at challenges. He's an affable guy. Again, didn't seem to know anything about what was going on strategically in the game, but I don't know. He won the season. That's something. So again, he's the pick here. Now for the letter G, and the letter G is a bit of a tough one here. There's a whole bunch of like competent players, but not really anyone that's like in the upper echelon, which makes it a bit tough to actually pick a player here. Though again, considerations, I think you got some, again, competent players that played one time. Again, Gabby Pitscusi has some good moments here and there. You got some pretty impressive older one-time players, like the likes of Gary Hogaboom from Guatemala. You got Greg from Survivor Palau. Again, both very solid players in their own right. You got the likes of Jervis Peterson, who is in contention, who obviously has a finalist appearance and obviously played on Borneo and didn't play perfectly well, but again, still had a deep run there. Also, you have one winner on the board here, and that is Gabler, to where, I mean, to be fair, it was actually kind of close. Gabler was almost the pick here. However, I did end up going with the other person, and that other person is Gavin from Survivor Edge of Extinction, which if you were to tell me I would pick Gavin as an answer for a video like this, I thought you would be insane. But again, I think Gavin is the pick here. Now again, I think between him and Gabler, you could definitely argue Gabler. Gabler's obviously a winner. However, I think Gavin's navigation through the game in Edge of Extinction is a lot more impressive. I obviously had a really big rant about him at the time of my Edge of Extinction review. However, again, I think at the end of the day, again, the way he was able to navigate through the game, never be targeted the entire time, still get to the end with some win equity. Had he gotten to the end again, his actual and planned final three of Julie Lauren, he more than likely wins. And really, just in general, he feels like a very well-rounded player. To where, again, I feel like he is the pick here just because there's not really that many other great options. And he's someone that, again, at least came relatively close to winning the game. While also, again, feeling like someone that could do it again. So again, I don't feel that with Gabler. So again, that's why I went with Gavin here. Next up for the letter H. And the letter H is also a very difficult one where there's not really an upper echelon player from the letter H. There's not even a single winner from the letter H. And really everyone I considered here was a one-time player. To where it was a tough grouping to pick from. The contenders here were Heidi, both Heidis. Again, Heidi from the Amazon and Heidi also from 44, to where, again, I wasn't particularly impressed by Heidi from 44, but again, that kind of shows you who's in contention here. But also Heidi from Amazon, again, is a competent player. Again, one that did have a lot of control of major portions of the game, but I did not pick her. The two that were closer to being the pick here are Holly Hoffman, who, again, gets very close to being at Final Tribal. Would have been at Final Tribal had it not been for Fabio's immunity run, though. At the same time, I don't feel like she had any real win equity, to where, from what we've heard, it does feel like it would have been Chase versus Sash if she had gone to the final three anyway. But again, she's not really my pick. And the other person I very much considered was Hannah Shapiro, who also is a player that, again, I think is pretty underrated. Again, I've always talked about how I personally would have voted for Hannah over Adam. However, I just feel like she's a bit of an inconsistent player, to where I don't know how she would do on a return. So again, I did not pick her. However, the person I did pick is someone that's a bit weird, but I did end up going with Hayden Moss from Blood vs. Water. Now, again, obviously, I'm probably considering some aspects of his Big Brother run here, which probably wouldn't have mattered in most situations. Had we had a truly elite player on the board here, I would have just went with them and not really thought about Hayden. However, because, again, we're in a field of, again, kind of just okay one-time players, I feel like Hayden kind of stands out here, and someone I have a lot of confidence in any given season. A very well-rounded player, good physically, socially, and strategically, to where, again, I think Hayden is probably the most well-rounded pick on the board, so I went with him here. Next for the letter I, and there's literally only two people to even talk about here, both of which somehow coming from Survivor Palau. First up, we have Ibrahim. I'm not picking Ibrahim, so I'm picking Ian. Now, again, I actually think Ian is a very solid player. I mean, to be fair, like, again, there's worse people to pick than Ian Rosenberger, but I just find it funny how limited the options are for the letter I, and again, I think Ian is a very competent player. Again, I think someone's probably not meant for Survivor, I think is probably the big thing, but I think he's kind of like just too kind-hearted of a person to really be able to pull off these cutthroat maneuvers that he needs to do, to where, again, we see him really struggle over having to take out Tom, and despite him actually like seeming to be willing to pull the trigger at one point, and he essentially ends up quitting the game because of his guilt for doing so, to where, again, I do think Ian is still a very solid player, though. Again, he is a final immunity challenge win away if he was caring about the game at that point from winning the game, and again was also pretty solidly positioned throughout most of the game. Also, I think he gets kind of screwed by the fact that Tom ends up winning out, to where, again, I think there's good definitely to be had with Ian, but again, I did not actually expect him to be the pick here. Next up for the letter J, and here there's a pretty obvious answer, but finally back to a letter that does have a decent amount of contenders, though. I mean, as for one-time players, you got someone like Jacqueline, who's a finalist. You have Jason, who always looked at as an underrated player. You got Kyle Jason, who had some decent plays at points. You got Jen Lyon, who I think is a very underrated player and came relatively close to winning the game. You obviously got Jesse from 43, who is also a very impressive modern player. John Mish is in contention. Josh Canfield's pretty decent. You got Julie from 45, who again seemingly played a pretty impressive game. You got some returning players, most of which weren't overtly impressive, but again, still had at least 2 solid runs from the likes of like James Clement. You have Jenna Lewis. You have Jerry Manthe. You have Jonathan Penner. You have Johnny Fairplay. Again, you got a couple winners I ended up picking in the likes of Jenna Maraska and obviously JT Thomas, who was probably the closest to being the pick here, though the person I did end up going with is kind of obvious and one of the best players of all time in my mind. That person is Jeremy Collins. And again, Jeremy's the only person here that is in my actual top 10 players of all time. And through that, again, it kind of made this an easy pick. I feel like Jeremy is a player that, while, again, definitely had some rockiness to really all 3 of his games, I think he definitely demonstrates some really great ability in every facet of the game. Again, while again, not the best in individual challenges, definitely someone that is very rarely going to be an early boot due to him being looked at as someone that has physical strength for the tribe. You also have him being very affable socially. I feel like almost no one leaves the season hating Jeremy. He's also able to build really strong one-on-one connections, and strategically, again, he most of the time knows what he's doing. Again, there's definitely points in Winners at War where he's kind of on the outs of things, and also is blindside a couple times here and there. But again, I think as a whole, very competent player, one of the best players of all time. So again, easy pick here. Next for the letter K, and kind of same thing. I mean, again, there's definitely considerations here, but there was a very solid answer. But again, people I considered, you have Katie Gallagher, who, again, at least is a finalist. Didn't play an overtly impressive game, but again, did make it all the way to the end, so that's something. Katura, I think also, someone to at least mention here, to where, while definitely had a lot of flaws in her game, I think he's also someone that had the right idea at points. You got someone like a Kathy Vavrick O'Brien, who has a very impressive Marquesas game and an okay All-Star game. You have Keith Nail, who, again, isn't an overtly impressive player, but still made it towards the end twice with some win equity both times, more so in San Juan del Sur. But also you got Kelly Wentworth, who I very much considered probably the closest to actually being the pick here of the people I didn't pick. As for winners, again, I did not pick Kenzie, to where, again, I think Kenzie's a very competent player, though I think there's also a lot of holes in her game, to where I did not pick her. And really the ultimate pick here, kind of obvious, it's Kim Spradlin. It's not close. Again, I think Kim Spradlin's one of the best players of all time. Obviously has what, in my opinion, is the best winning game of all time, and it's not really close. And even beyond that, again, even in Winners at War, a position where she came in with a massive target on her back, I feel like she even played pretty competently there. But while she was at the bottom at multiple points in the season, I feel like she played well from the bottom most of the time. So again, I think Kim is another very well-rounded player, good at every aspect of the game, very good at challenges, really strong socially, and also, again, a competent strategic player. So again, I think she's the easy pick here. Next up for the letter L, and the letter L is weird here, is I very much expected there to be some really big names here, but there actually isn't. To where the person I end up going with here was actually a big surprise to me, though. As for the considerations, I mean, I would consider Laurel from Ghost Island, where I know a lot of people are very down on Laurel because she never makes the move against Dom and Wendell, but I do think there is some very good play in how she navigates through the game at points, to where, yes, I do think she doesn't make the move that she should have and try to get them out. I feel like she still plays a pretty competent game all around, but did not pick her. I also considered a lot of Laurens. I did consider Lauren Harp from 44, to where, while she's not an overtly impressive player, she still made it towards the end of a lot of win equity. You got Lauren O'Connell from Edge of Extinction, who, while she didn't have much win equity, I think the way she navigated through the game was pretty impressive at points. We got Lauren Rimmer from HHH, where, again, in the world where Ben Draybergen doesn't have an idol, I think Lauren's in a pretty good spot to win the game. I also considered Lindsay from 42, who was actually, like, not that far away from being my pick here somehow. I also considered Lisa Welchel, who obviously was a finalist, and I think played a pretty decent game on Philippines, so I didn't pick her. As for returning players, you got Laura Morat, who I was never really considering, but again, she played twice and made the merge both times, so that's something. But I think the person that was closest to being picked here that I did not pick ends up being Lex. And again, I very much considered Lex. I did feel like Lex obviously ran Africa very impressively, had a solid game in All-Stars, obviously makes one critical mistake, but again, very close to picking him, though the person I did end up picking is Lauren Ashley Beck from Survivor IOI. And again, I think this is definitely a debate. I mean, obviously Lex has 2 appearances, Lauren only has 1, and I think there's definitely the argument that Lex's Africa game is stronger than Lauren's IOI game. However, I do feel more confident about Lauren as a player in the grand scheme of things than Lex, to where I feel like Lauren is the type of player that just does well in almost every season that she's on. I feel like she's someone that is so affable socially, to where people are always going to want to keep her around. She also has a decent strategic mind, where while, again, I think she's being outplayed by Tommy for most of her post-merge in IOI, I still feel, again, she does have some very impressive acumen there, while also being, again, competent in challenges to where she won't be voted out. To where in comparison to someone like Lex, I feel like Lex is a bit rough around the edges. I feel like he could definitely turn some people away socially. I think he definitely has some very wonky strategic decision-making at points of him being extremely hypocritical and the way he navigates through things, to where I think that also can end up burning him jury votes, to where, again, I think it is somewhat close between the two. However, I decided that I have more faith in Lauren Ashley Beck, so she is my pick here. Next for the letter M, and I did not go with the person I was expecting here, though, again, there's a lot of considerations. As for one-time players, I mean, you got the likes of Marcus from Gabon, who obviously was somewhat close to winning the game, despite being taken out relatively early, to where had he been able to make the merge, he probably just steamrolls from that point on, but didn't pick him. Also considered Maddie, who was one challenge away from winning Gabon, and also was in a spot where if Sugar did not change her mind at the last second, he more than likely wins. I didn't pick him. Also considered a range of Mikes here from the likes of Mike Chisel, who very likely wins that season, has Apatera gotten the majority. You got Mike Turner, who also came in the final tribal with a good chunk of votes. Did not pick him. Also considered Mike White, who I think plays one of the more impressive runner-up games in the history of the show. Yeah, I did not pick him either. Also considered Maria for 46, who was able to ride the middle of that season for a lot of it, to where that was somewhat impressive, but did not pick her. As for returning players, considered Monica Culpepper, who obviously makes it to the end in her second appearance, did not pick her. Probably the most shocking thing to me is that I expected to pick Malcolm coming into this list. Yeah, I do think over time, my opinion on Malcolm as a player has probably gone down a bit. I do feel like Malcolm is a player that I think Philippines is kind of an anomaly, more so than the norm, to where I think most time he plays, he just has this massive bullseye on his back. To where I do think he got pretty fortunate how Philippines in particular played out. So while, again, he was very close to being the pick, I did not pick him here. And I also have a couple winners that I very much considered, but did not pick. I did not pick Marianne, who, again, I think is just too inconsistent in my mind, where I do not expect Marianne to be able to do well on the majority of her appearances. So again, I did not pick her, even though, again, she does have decent acumen at points. Also did not pick Michelle Fitzgerald, who, again, I think some people would definitely pick here. I think people obviously look at her as having 2 finalist appearances and 1 win in that. Again, that is impressive on paper. Yeah, I think just the way she navigates through the game is not in an overtly impressive way to me. To where, while she was definitely in contention, she's definitely alongside Malcolm. She was not the person I picked here. The person I did pick, though, ends up being Mike Holloway from Worlds Apart, which I was not expecting to pick here. Yeah, I think when really thinking about it, I do feel like Mike Holloway, one, is a better player than what his winning game demonstrated, but also I think through his winning game, he really demonstrated a lot. He demonstrated him being able to lead an alliance and really dictate how the votes are going. Also showed him playing from the bottom. And while, again, he was in this spot where he either needed to win challenges or find an idol to survive in the game, while it's not my favorite way of navigating through the game, again, I guess he did it. But also, I think the thing that's more impressive about Mike, for me over time, is the fact that despite being on the bottom and being someone that would have been voted out if he didn't win challenges, he still was able to have power in the game. He was still able to corral votes together and never stopped trying in the game, to where I think for me, again, the difference between Mike and Malcolm is that, again, we see Mike being able to navigate that threat level that I think Malcolm would always have as well. While in comparison to Michelle, I think he just had more agency in his game than Michelle has in both of her appearances, where really I feel like it can go wrong. She had very little agency throughout the entirety of that game, and in Winners at War, she even then doesn't have much agency for most of that game. Really, the only time she really leads a vote is the Ethan vote, and outside of that, she doesn't really get her way. Is being left out on most of what's going on. So again, I think at the end of the day, I think I'm going to go with Mike Holloway. So yeah, I think there's definitely arguments for Michelle. I think there's definitely arguments for Malcolm. Yeah, I just think the way that Mike demonstrated playing from both the top and the bottom of that season is enough to make him my actual pick here. Next for the letter N, and I have a feeling this won't be a very popular pick, but either way, I mean, again, contenders, we got Nalia, who came 1 vote away from winning, more than likely does win if she has a solid final trial performance. Yeah, again, did not pick her. Well, also, we got a lot of Natalies. We have Natalie Bolton, who, again, didn't have the most win equity, but still, again, was part of the Black Widow Brigade, definitely someone to talk about. We got multiple winners named Natalie. We got Natalie White, who, again, wasn't that close to being the pick here, but again, won the game, so that's something. And also we have Natalie Anderson. I think this might be the more controversial aspect of it, where I think a lot of people would want me to pick Natalie Anderson here. And again, I think Natalie Anderson's appearance on San Juan del Sur is very impressive. More impressive than either of my number 1 picks games. However, for me, I do feel like Winners at War has really lowered me on Natalie Anderson, to where I really did not love how much she changed her game in Winners at War, to where she essentially did the complete antithesis to what she did the first time around. Where the first time around, she played this very bold game game that had her making these very impressive maneuvers through the game. Yeah, in Winners at War, she just plays scared. And it's also the first boot of the season, where obviously that's partially due to pregame stuff. I also feel like she doesn't play that round perfectly optimally either. And the person I'm going with here is sadly Nick Wilson. Again, I don't want to pick Nick Wilson here. Again, I would rather pick Natalie. I think when genuinely looking at their overall game quality, I think I gotta go Nick Wilson. Again, he has 2 deep appearances. Now, technically, Natalie has the highest average in Survivor history, but obviously she was the first boot on one of those seasons. But again, Nick wins the season of David vs. Goliath in a solid way. Again, definitely wonky parts of that. Again, he potentially would have been the first boot had the Pat Medorak not happen. He also, again, gets blindsided numerous times in the post-merge, but still, definitely points where he has a lot of agency. I think him pulling together the minority vote split is still one of the most impressive individual moves in Survivor history. And again, he seemed to have so much social capital on that season. And for him to come back immediately onto Winners at War, in a spot where he actually did have a pretty decent target on his back, but not from the way that it typically happens in returning seasons of, oh, you're too big of a threat, so we gotta target you. Nick instead had a target on his back because he was the newest winner. Because he was the new guy on the block, and he was just an easy person to throw out. To where I think the fact that Nick was able to navigate that target and get towards the end game, I think is impressive there. Well, again, there's definitely points where he's out with numbers in that game. I still feel, again, he has 2 pretty solid performances. Again, one win, obviously, and the other one has a very deep run that doesn't have them being voted out and came back to the game. And again, I think he is also a decently well-rounded player. For a while, again, don't agree with him politically. I do feel like that's never really seemed to actually harm him in the game, and in general just feels like a player that, again, is just a very solid all-around player. So again, I end up going with him here. Next up for the letter O, and this one is actually kind of tough here. Now, there aren't really that many players whose names start with the letter O, though there are 3 competent ones here. Now, technically Owen from 43 is one of those, which, again, I like Owen, but also his game's not particularly great, but he is a finalist, so I mean, that's something to at least mention. But really, it's between 2 other ones, and really, it's a big debate here between one that had a very solid one-time appearance, played a very impressive game on their one time, or a player that has 4 appearances and almost wins the game numerous times, where I sadly end up going that person, even though I think the more fun pick would have been Omer. I think Omer, again, had a very impressive game in 42. I do think he's a player that demonstrated a lot of ability on that season. Yet at the same time, I just don't know if he'll be able to consistently do that. So the person I went with here, obviously, is Ozzy. And again, I don't think Ozzy's as fun of a player. I don't think he is a player that I have much faith in winning the game on most given seasons, where even on South Pacific, obviously that was just solely due to Redemption Island. I mean, really, Cook Island's the only time he actually naturally gets towards the end of the game, but he still makes their merge 4 times. Again, he is a very consistent player. I feel like he's definitely more consistent than someone like Omer, where I think Omer definitely has a chance of being an early boot on some given seasons. And again, just that consistency from Ozzy and him having, again, 2 seasons where he almost wins the game. Again, it's enough to put him as my pick here. Next for the letter P, and I mean, obviously there's a very easy answer here. And to be honest, there weren't really many other considerations. I mean, we're looking at like the other people that were in consideration here. Again, you got like Pascal from Marquesas, who again was okay. Then you got someone like PG, who isn't the most impressive player in the grand scheme of things. You got someone like a Phillip, who also not the most impressive player in the grand scheme of things. So obviously the answer here is Parvati. I mean, Parvati, again, top 5 player full-time for me. I think she's one of the best players of all time, even though, again, I definitely have more faults in her game than what it seems like most people do. I still think, again, she is a very impressive player. She showed this level of consistency over 3 seasons, and again, her coming into Heroes of Villains with a massive target on her back, and her still being able to get to the very end is still very impressive there. However, again, I definitely have qualms with how she treats people at certain points in the game. I also have issues with some of her strategic decision-making. Yeah, at the end of the day, obviously, Parvati is still one of the best players of all time. Easily the pick here. Next up for the letter Q. And who do you think? I mean, there's literally only one person in the history of Survivor whose first name starts with the letter Q, so it's Q, obviously. I mean, Q is, again, not the greatest player in the grand scheme of things. Really, I think he might be the worst player of any of the picks that we've had up to this point, and will probably ultimately be the worst player picked for this video, though again, that could be a little bit of a debate, but I mean, he's the only option. And Trip, I mean, that is actually what made me concept this video. I did create the idea for this video after seeing Q on the cast of 46, and that obviously he's the first person to ever be on the show starting with the letter Q, so I was like, oh, that's kind of an interesting thing. So again, I guess thank the casting of Q for this video existing. Obviously, there wasn't much of an option here in the pick here. Next up for the letter R, and I mean, this one also has a pretty easy answer, though there are a decent amount of considerations. I mean, there's some pretty solid one-time players on this list. Again, we got the likes of Rafe, who obviously comes, again, 1 challenge away from winning the game. We got the likes of Ricard, who also played a pretty solid game, though was just too big of a threat by the end. We got the likes of Rick Devens, who, again, you can definitely qualm with how he navigates through a game. Yeah, again, was 1 challenge away from winning the game in near unanimous fashion. We got Rodney, who runs a lot of Worlds Apart, though did not pick him. Also considered Ryan Ulrich, who I think is a understated player in Survivor history. I did not pick him. From the returning player side of things, you got Rob Cesternino, who obviously is a very innovative player at the time. Definitely in consideration here, though did not make the cut. Also, I considered Rupert. Obviously not because he's played an elite game on any of his seasons. Again, he showed himself to be a consistent player where taking Blood vs. Water out of it, he's consistently made the merge every single time. That's at least something. Also considered Russell Hantz, who again, at least has 2 final appearances. That's something, but did not pick him. The only winner I did not pick was Richard Hatch, who obviously was the first winner, though, again, I think Richard Hatch is probably just an overrated player in the grand scheme of things, where I don't think he's someone that could do it again and wouldn't be able to do it on most given seasons. But again, someone to at least mention here. But obviously the pick here, again, top 10 player of all time. Easily to pick here, it's Boston Rob. Now, again, I know there's detractors of Boston Rob that don't think he's actually that good, and again, I don't have him in my top 5 of Survivor players, but I do think he's a top 10 player. I do think he's a player that possibly understands the game of Survivor more than any other player, to where, again, just listening to Boston Rob talk about the game of Survivor, you can just tell this wealth of knowledge that he has about the game and this experience that he's picked up on through his 5 seasons. And that's obviously the thing, a qualm with him is that it took him 4 seasons to win the game. But he also still has 2 finalist appearances. On every one of his seasons, he has at least a portion of the game where he is in control of what his tribe is doing, to where, while obviously Winners at War didn't turn out to be the greatest season for him, I also feel like, again, he had a massive target on his back to begin with. And in general, again, I still think Rob is one of the best players of all time, to where, while there's definitely faults to be had there, especially amongst the best of the best, I feel like, again, for a field like this, I feel like he was the pretty solid pick there. Next, for the letter S. And the letter S, again, a lot of contenders here. Again, you got some finalists to talk about from the likes of Sabrina and the likes of Sash, both of which, again, at least made it to the end, but neither of them were my pick. You got Scout, who was probably one challenge win away from beating Twyla, I guess, but again, did not pick her. Shan is someone to at least talk about, someone that ran a decent portion of 41, yet did not pick her. From the returning player side of things, you got someone like Sierra Dawn Thomas, who I think is kind of an understated player in Survivor history, where I actually think she played decently well in Game Changers, and even her first appearance, but did not pick her. Also considered Spencer, who is one of the better one-time players, though obviously still very flawed and was not really that close to making it on. Also, similar thing with Stephen Fishback, who, again, also, I think played a very good Tocantins game, but was not that close to making it on. Also considered Stephanie LaGrossa, but also, again, wonky games in the grand scheme of things. From the winner side of things, I did consider Sandra, but she was not the pick here. So again, despite her winning 2 times, I feel like neither of those wins are particularly impressive from my point of view, at least in terms of how she navigated through the game, where I feel like she kind of gets to the end by failing at things that she's trying to do. But also I consider Sophie Clark, who, again, was in contention. However, I think there was a pretty solid number 1 here. Again, not picking this person for personal reasons, just purely gameplay. Gotta go Sarah Lacina. Again, Sarah Lacina, at this point, top 5 player of all time. I think, again, she's had 2 extremely impressive runs on the show. Obviously, being able to play the middle of that game very well. And it was able to pretty much dominate Winners at War alongside Tony, where while Tony, again, was more so in the driver's seat for more of that season, I feel like Sarah also had pretty solid connections that allowed them to have that power structure to begin with, and also gets to the end in a spot where she more than likely wins if she gets to the end against anybody but Tony. And even in Cagayan, I think she demonstrates some decent play at points. So again, I think for me, Sarah Lacina is pretty easily the pick here. Next up for T, and come on. No, actually, the letter T is probably one of the most stacked letters, having a pretty good grouping of contenders here. I mean, one-time players, you got someone like Taj, who played a competent game in Tocantins. T-Bird played a very good game in Africa. Twyla, again, navigated through the game in a very impressive way. And Vanuatu, even though, again, could not win the game. Got some decent returning players from the likes of Tai Trang and Tasha, who both made it towards the end of the game twice and was a finalist once. So again, that's impressive. Not make it on. You got 6 winners in total that start with the letter T. Obviously, one of those is my ultimate pick here, but the ones I did not pick, again, got Tina Wesson. I think to this day is probably one of the more impressive female winners from a winning game point of view. You got Todd Herzog, who played a very impressive game. Tom showed himself to be a very well-rounded player in Palau. Tommy, I have very much hyped up over time, and actually, Tommy, I believe, was number 2 for the letter T here. Again, I think Tommy's a player that demonstrated some very strong play from the top and bottom. Tyson, also a very impressive player, though, again, a little bit inconsistent at points, even though, again, I think his knowledge of the game is very vast, like Boston Rob's is. But at the end of the day, again, number 1's Tony. It's not close. Again, Tony won twice, but even beyond that, again, the reason why I have him assessed higher than Sandra is because I think both of his wins are very impressive. Both of them are very domineering wins, with him having a good amount of control throughout both of those. Where while obviously he has a bad Game Changers appearance, I still think his Winners at War game is probably one of the most impressive games ever played, while also him being a very innovative player, and just in general, again, for me, the best player of all time. So again, easily my pick here. That's for the letter U, and there's actually not a pick to be had from the letter U. U is the only letter in the history of Survivor US to not have a player with the first name starting with it. There's no one to even pick here, and straight up from this point on in the list, there's actually like not many options. I never even realized until doing the process for this video, the fact that so many Survivor players' first names are really clumped together in certain portions of this list, where by the time we get to the end of the outfit, there's very few options. But again, moving on to the letter V, again, there's really one easy answer. There's a couple people to talk about. Again, Victoria from Edge of Extinction, someone that I think is a very solid player, very solid, one-time non-winner, but again, was not the pick. Also considered Vetus, who played twice, though really wasn't that close to being the pick, where really the pick here was kind of easy. The only winner in contention here, and that person is Vecepia. And again, Vecepia is a player that I definitely have issues with her game. I've talked about it numerous times in the past. However, again, there's not many options here, and I think in comparison to this field, like while it was, again, her or Victoria, I feel like, again, the fact that she won and played an impressive game for the time, with her being involved in some pretty big moves at the time, again, it's enough to make her my pick here. Next up for the letter W. And W is another one that has a pretty solid answer, though in a couple like minor considerations. You got someone like Will Wall, I guess. Again, he pulled off a big move, right? Again, did not pick him. War Dog was probably more in contention. Again, definitely pulled off multiple really strong maneuvers in Edge of Extinction, though obviously just did a bit too much and made himself too big of a target. So, again, that wasn't particularly great by the end. Also, Wu is someone that obviously played twice, made it to the end once. Again, somewhat impressive, but again, the easy pick here is Wendell. I mean, Wendell's the winner, the only winner in contention here. While, again, that win is a little bit rocky, I still think very impressive player. To where, again, while Winners at War was not the greatest run from him, I still think he's a player that, again, is good at every facet of the game. Again, very good physically, very affable socially, very good strategic mind as well. I think he's a very solid player, easily the pick here. Next up for the letter X, and there's actually only one person in Survivor history that starts with the letter X, and that person is Xander from 41. And even this is, again, Xander's real name is Alexander, so it's not even really an X, but again, he went by Xander's. So again, he qualifies, and yeah, he's here. And truth be told, I mean, it could have been worse. I mean, Xander's still a finalist, where while I do think, again, his game was very much overhyped by the casual audience, I still think he is a competent player. For while he definitely was on the bottom for the entire first half of his game, I think his back portion of his game is actually pretty decent. For while I think he definitely mismanages the jury and had a bad read on the jury, I feel like as a whole, again, he's an okay player. Obviously, also the only person I could even pick for this letter. Next up for the letter Y, where there was a very obvious pick, though. Again, definitely some considerations. Now, again, just in general, there's not many options to be had here. I mean, like, I'm not going to pick, like, Eve from Nicaragua or Yasmin from Samoa. Obviously, you got Yao-Man from Fiji. Very solid player. Also very inconsistent, to where, again, did not pick him. But the main considerations obviously come down to the two winners that start with the letter Y. The person I did not pick was Jam Jam, who I've probably gone down on Jam Jam as a player over time. I think Jam Jam is a player that, again, at the time that he won, I was very high on him. I thought he had a very good social game. I thought he was someone that had this killer instinct. And again, just in general, seemed like a very good player. I think over time, I'm kind of lower on that. I don't think he really has that killer instinct. And really, just in general, he is also someone that, again, can definitely annoy some people at points socially. For all he does have this very natural charisma, I feel like he's also, again, a player that I could see messing up his own game if he doesn't have this strategic player that's kind of guiding him in the game. So the person I did go with here is obviously Yul. And again, Yul's pretty far and away number one by the end of it. I think Yul is a very strong player in the grand scheme of things. Again, played a very well-rounded game in Cook Islands. Again, was very good at challenges. Again, just was beat by Ozzy, but again, was second to Ozzy in most challenges. He played one of the most impressive strategic games in the history of the show, while also, again, was liked socially. Now, again, he barely wins a jury vote against Ozzy, but more like he wins against the majority of other people anyway, to where, and I do think Yul is a very, very solid player. To where, again, while his Winners at War appearance did not go great for him by the end, I think he still has some pretty decent play throughout a lot of that, being in the middle, until he kind of gets swap screwed or being swapped with all of his allies, to where there weren't many options there. But again, I still think Yul played a pretty impressive game, so again, easily the pick here. And now we're at the final letter of the alphabet. We have the letter Z, which is probably one of the weirdest ones, where there's not many people to pick from, and there is a pretty definitive pick just because of that. But again, I'm not going to pick Zoe from Marquesas. I'm not going to pick Zane Knight. And as much as I like Zach Wurtenberger as a online personality, I'm not going to pick him. So, I mean, the answer has to be Zeke, who, again, is definitely a questionable player. I mean, this is the person I was referencing earlier, where, again, I think him and Q are probably on around the same level. But again, I think Zeke definitely has impressive aspects to his game. I mean, he is someone that pulled off some pretty decent maneuvers in Legend X. And again, he got an entire group of people he just started working with to go to rocks for him, which is pretty insane. And while, again, he definitely did mismanage his threat level on that season, I think, again, he had some decent play there. And in Game Changers, obviously a lot of that game's just kind of tainted by the Josh Varner situation, where I think that radically changes how Zeke wanted to play the game and puts him out in front in a way that he really didn't want to be. So again, I don't really take much into consideration from Game Changers, but obviously just in general, again, not the greatest player in the world. Definitely, again, subpar for someone that we're talking about amongst like the best players, but again, for the letter Z, I mean, he's pretty far and away the pick here. But with that, again, that is the best player for every letter of the alphabet for Survivor US. Now, moving forward, I will be doing the exact same thing for Big Brother, just because, I guess. I mean, I might as well. After a while, I mean, the majority of it will just follow my Big Brother player ranking. I still want to make a Big Brother version of the video. I also want to do a favorite character version of this video as well, which again, I'll be doing at some point down the road. In general, I have other ideas for taking this formula and shifting it into other videos. So again, stay tuned for those, and just in general, stay tuned for more of the same style of content from the channel. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.